I had just settled into my chair after a long day, ready to enjoy my favorite TV show. It was one of the few simple pleasures I allowed myself, a routine that kept the chaos of the world at bay. Just as the story was getting interesting, the door slammed open, and my wife stormed in like a whirlwind. Without a word, she snatched the remote from my hand and turned off the television. I sat back, arms crossed, waiting for an explanation. "We have a problem," she announced, her voice sharp with frustration. I took a moment, studying her expression. "What kind of problem?" I asked. Her tone suggested it was something dire, but the way she paced the room told me it was more personal than urgent. She stopped in front of me and crossed her arms, her frustration pouring out in a flood of words. Apparently, her friend, someone I only vaguely knew, had landed a high-paying job despite having no relevant experience. The injustice of it all was apparently compounded by my supposed lack of support for her ambitions. I raised a hand to slow her down. "Hold on," I said. "First of all, the world doesn't revolve around you. Second, let's get some facts straight. What kind of job does she have?" That question seemed to stop her for a moment. She admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that she didn't know. Her friend hadn't shared any details, claiming the nature of the work was very secretive. I couldn't help but smirk at that. It sounded like the kind of vague explanation people use when they don't want to be questioned. "So, let me get this straight," I said. "You're upset over something you don't fully understand, and you're blaming me for not magically fixing it?" She glared at me, but before she could fire back, I offered a suggestion. "Invite her over. She's always been a bit loose-lipped after a few glasses of wine. Maybe you'll get the answers you're looking for." To my surprise, she paused, considering the idea. After a moment, her expression shifted from frustration to something closer to enthusiasm. "You know," she said, "that might actually work. If I get her talking, maybe I can figure out if there's a way for me to get a foot in the door." I nodded, satisfied that I'd steered the conversation toward something productive. If nothing else, it would give me a reprieve from her venting. "But," I added, "if she's making a lot of money with no experience, don't you think there's a chance it's not all on the level?" That comment gave her pause, but only briefly. She argued that her friend's family had money, so maybe it was just a matter of connections. I shrugged. "Could be. Either way, it's worth finding out before you waste any more energy being upset about it." By now, she was fully on board with the plan. She grabbed her phone and started dialing her friend's number. I leaned back in my chair, content to let her take the lead. As much as I dislike being dragged into these dramas, there was a part of me that was genuinely curious. What kind of job could pay so well and remain so secretive? When she hung up the phone, she looked at me with a triumphant smile. Her friend had agreed to come over the next day. I nodded and reached for the remote, ready to pick up where I'd left off with my show. But as I settled back in, a thought lingered in the back of my mind: what kind of work was this friend really involved in? It didn't sit right with me, but I'd wait to hear more before making any judgments. My wife took the preparation for her friend's visit more seriously than I had anticipated. She went out early in the day and came back with a bottle of wine, her friend's favorite, apparently, and ordered a pizza from the place that always seemed overpriced to me. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I could tell she was determined to make the evening perfect. Her energy was palpable, and she darted around the kitchen, setting the table and adjusting every little detail. It wasn't like her to be this meticulous, but I figured she had her reasons. When her friend arrived, I couldn't help but notice how overdressed she was. High heels, a flashy dress, and enough makeup to make her look ready for a gala rather than a casual evening at home. My wife greeted her enthusiastically, ushering her in like she was royalty. Before I could even think about joining the conversation, my wife turned to me with a sweet but firm tone. "Honey, why don't you go relax in the other room? We'll just chat for a bit." I got the message loud and clear: my presence wasn't needed, yet. I retreated to the living room, letting the sound of their voices filter through the walls. They talked about everything under the sun, from mutual friends to some celebrity gossip that I had no interest in. After about half an hour, the laughter grew louder, and I figured it was time to make my entrance. When I walked into the dining room, the wine bottle was nearly empty, and both women looked a little too pleased with themselves. "Sounds like you're having fun," I said casually, taking a seat. My wife's friend turned to me with a smile that was just a touch too wide. I decided to cut to the chase. "So, what's this mysterious job you have?" My wife's been dying to know. My tone was light, almost joking, but I kept my eyes on her. She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in as if she were about to share a state secret. "All right," she said, lowering her voice. "But you can't tell anyone. It's an investment company. We deal with very wealthy clients who need privacy. My job is pretty straightforward. I handle calls, schedule appointments, and make sure everything runs smoothly. The company prides itself on being discreet. It's all about protecting the client's assets and ensuring their income is clean and untouchable." She paused, her eyes darting to my wife as if gauging her reaction. "Sounds interesting," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Must be a lot of responsibility." She nodded, then quickly changed the subject. "By the way, isn't your birthday coming up soon?" she asked my wife, her tone suddenly light and cheerful. My wife beamed and nodded, confirming that it was only 2 weeks away. The conversation shifted entirely after that. The friend teased my wife about getting ready for a big surprise. "Just you wait," she said, her tone almost conspiratorial. "You'll love it." My wife's curiosity was piqued instantly, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. Whatever this surprise was, it had her more excited than I'd seen her in a long time. As the evening wound down, I kept my thoughts to myself. Something about the whole situation still didn't sit right with me, but I figured there was no point in pressing the issue now. When the friend's ride arrived, my wife walked her to the door, practically glowing with excitement. They hugged, exchanged promises to talk soon, and then the friend was gone. The moment the door closed, my wife turned to me with wide eyes and a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "What do you think it is?" she asked, practically bouncing on her heels. I shrugged, playing it cool, but she wasn't having it. She spent the next hour guessing and speculating, her energy filling the house. Whatever was coming, she was determined to figure it out before the big day. A few days had passed since the evening with my wife's friend, and things were back to normal, or as normal as they could be. Then, out of the blue, I received a call from her friend. I was a bit surprised, considering I rarely heard from her directly. "Hey," she began, her voice unusually cheerful. "I know you're planning your wife's birthday celebration, but I was wondering if you could move it to the day after. It'll be worth it, trust me." Her request caught me off guard, and I asked her why. "Let's just say there's an important opportunity related to that job she's been so curious about. It'll make her day even more special." I agreed, but not without a bit of skepticism. "All right," I said. "We can move the celebration, but this better be good." She laughed and assured me it would be. After the call, I relayed the information to my wife, who immediately lit up with excitement. She didn't even question the change in plans, already envisioning what this important opportunity might be. Her enthusiasm was infectious, though I kept my reservations to myself. When her birthday arrived, I gave her a gift in the morning as planned, something I had put a lot of thought into. She was delighted, showering me with thanks and affection, but her mind was clearly on the dinner we were set to attend later. As evening approached, we dressed for the occasion, and she practically buzzed with anticipation. The restaurant her friend had chosen was far more upscale than any place we'd usually visit, the kind of spot where you wouldn't feel out of place in a suit and tie. When we arrived, her friend was already there, waiting near the entrance with a man I hadn't seen before. She introduced him as her partner, and they exchanged pleasantries with my wife before leading us to a private room. Inside, a few well-dressed individuals were waiting. The atmosphere was formal but oddly relaxed, as though these people were used to meetings like this. My wife's friend wasted no time getting to the point. "Your wife has impressed me," she said, addressing the room. "She's smart, organized, and knows how to lead." Exactly what we need for our growing team. The others nodded in agreement, and one of the men, dressed in a sharp tuxedo, turned to my wife. We've been told you're great at managing people, and we're looking for someone to bring order to a few areas where things have gotten a bit chaotic. He smiled. Do you think you're up for it? My wife, her eyes shining, didn't hesitate. Absolutely, she said. That's something I'm confident I can handle. They seemed pleased with her answer, but quickly moved on to the terms of the job. You'll need to leave your current position, another man explained. At first, you'll be working unofficially while we finalize some paperwork. It's a technicality, but it's how we ensure things move quickly for the right candidates. I couldn't help but feel a pang of suspicion. Why unofficial? I asked, keeping my tone polite but firm. Isn't this supposed to be a high-end organization? Why not just follow standard procedures? One of the men nodded, seemingly expecting the question. It's simple, he said. We're a large company, and the formal hiring process can take months. By starting unofficially, you skip the red tape and get to work immediately. My wife barely needed convincing. The idea of diving straight into an exciting new role clearly appealed to her. I'll do it, she said enthusiastically. I'll resign from my current job and start as soon as you need me. They exchanged smiles and nods, and then one of them leaned in slightly. Great, he said. Because we have a very special assignment in mind for you. Details will follow soon. The whole exchange left me uneasy. While my wife was clearly over the moon, something about the arrangement didn't sit right with me. A personal assignment from the boss on the first day? I thought to myself. That's odd, to say the least. The day of the big celebration finally arrived, and it turned out to be even more eventful than I had expected. My wife decided to make a statement at her now former workplace before officially closing that chapter of her life. From what she had told me, the office environment was toxic to the point of absurdity. Petty arguments over trivial things, like who used the last roll of toilet paper, were common. So, in her signature fashion, she prepared farewell gifts for each of her adversaries, rolls of toilet paper neatly wrapped with ribbons. It was her way of delivering a pointed goodbye, sharp, but undeniably clever. By the time she left the office, she was practically glowing. Her exit had been as dramatic as it was satisfying, and she couldn't stop recounting the reactions of her former co-workers as we made final preparations for the party. I had gone all out for this celebration, renting a yacht for the evening and ensuring that there was more than enough food and drink to keep everyone happy. Friends of ours from all walks of life had been invited, making it a lively and diverse crowd. Everyone seemed ready to celebrate my wife's new chapter. As the guests arrived, the mood was electric. My wife's friend, the one who had been instrumental in her job opportunity, showed up fashionably late with her boyfriend in tow. I recognized him as the man we had met at the restaurant, and while he was polite enough, there was something about him that didn't sit well with me. His designer suit and carefully groomed appearance seemed out of place among our more casual and genuine crowd. They both stood out, not just because of their appearance, but also because of how they carried themselves, like they were sizing everyone up. As the evening progressed, I couldn't help but notice that the boyfriend kept finding excuses to pull my wife aside. Each time, he claimed it was for an urgent discussion about work. I watched them closely, but from a distance, not wanting to cause a scene. When the interruptions became too frequent to ignore, I approached her friend and asked, "What's the deal with your boyfriend? Why does he keep dragging my wife away from her own party?" She waved me off with a dismissive laugh. "Oh, don't worry about it. It's just work stuff. He's very particular about these things." I raised an eyebrow, not entirely convinced. "If I were you," I said, "I'd be concerned about how he's looking at her. It's not exactly professional." She rolled her eyes and told me to relax. "It's nothing. They'll be done soon." Still, I kept a close eye on them. Eventually, my wife returned to the main party, her expression light and carefree. "All good," she said with a quick smile. "I'll explain later. Let's just enjoy the night." That was enough to ease my immediate concerns, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. For now, though, I decided to take her at her word. With the minor distractions behind us, the party regained its momentum. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and the yacht's deck was alive with conversation and laughter. I focused on making sure our guests were having a good time, chatting with friends and catching up with people we hadn't seen in ages. My wife, meanwhile, seemed to be the center of attention, her energy and excitement infectious to everyone around her. As the evening wound down, I found myself reflecting on how far we'd come in the past few weeks. While there were still unanswered questions about her new job and the people involved, tonight wasn't the time to dwell on them. She was happy, and for now, that was enough. Later, when we were back home, I asked her again about the discussion she'd had with her friend's boyfriend. She brushed it off with a casual smile. "It's all good," she repeated. "I'll tell you more later." Her confidence was reassuring, and I decided to let it go. Whatever it was, we'd deal with it together. For now, the celebration continued in our memories, a reminder of the steps we were taking toward something new. The weekend finally arrived, giving me a much-needed break from work. My wife, on the other hand, was preparing for her first day at her new job. As she got ready, I couldn't help but notice her outfit. It was more revealing than what she usually wore, and it caught me off guard. "Why are you dressed like that?" I asked, my tone neutral but firm. She smiled as she adjusted her necklace. "I just want to look my best on my first day. It's important to make a good impression." Before I could say anything else, she grabbed her bag and hurried out the door, leaving me to my thoughts. I shrugged it off and went about my morning routine, thinking about how eager she seemed. About half an hour later, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I opened the door cautiously. Standing there was an old friend of mine from university, someone I hadn't seen in years. We exchanged greetings, and I invited him inside. It was a surprise, but a welcome one. He looked well, better than I remembered, actually. He'd always been the guy who took risks, and from what I'd heard, those risks had finally paid off. As we sat down, he started reminiscing about our college days. He'd been obsessed with cryptocurrency back then, spending endless hours analyzing graphs and market trends. While I had focused on building a stable career in IT, he had gambled everything on the volatile crypto market. Apparently, it had worked out for him. He leaned back in his chair and grinned. "I'm doing all right now. No wife, no kids, but I've got freedom. That's worth something, right?" I nodded, though I couldn't say I envied his lifestyle. Stability and family meant more to me. Then, out of nowhere, he brought up a topic that caught me completely off guard. "Have you ever heard of these VIP clubs? The kind where they have private rooms and holes, let's just say some girls give unique services?" He went on to describe a place he'd recently visited, complete with details I could have done without. I shook my head. "Not my thing," I said flatly. He laughed, as if my response was predictable. "Good," he said. "You've got a good wife. No need for distractions like that." His words were meant as a compliment, but the whole conversation left a sour taste in my mouth. After about an hour, he stood up to leave. "I'll be in town for a while," he said as he shook my hand. "Let's catch up again soon." I nodded and saw him to the door, relieved to have the house to myself again. His visit had been unexpected, and while it was good to see him, I couldn't shake the odd feeling his stories had left behind. Not long after he left, my phone rang. It was my wife. She sounded cheerful, though a little rushed. "Hey, just wanted to let you know we're having a corporate event tonight. I'll be home late." I told her it was fine and not to worry. She thanked me and hung up, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. I glanced at the clock, realizing I had the rest of the day to myself. The idea of diving into a project crossed my mind, but the comfort of my favorite TV show was far more tempting. Might as well make the most of the peace and quiet, I thought. Settling into my chair, I grabbed the remote and prepared to enjoy a rare, uninterrupted evening. When my wife came home that night, it was clear she'd had a bit too much to drink. She stumbled through the door, her face flushed with excitement. "It was amazing," she announced, practically singing her words. "The team is so young and energetic, and we all hit it off right away. It's going to be great working with them." I nodded, letting her enthusiasm wash over me. "That's good to hear," I said, keeping my tone even. "But what about that special assignment you mentioned? And the details of the job? Anything new there?" She waved a hand dismissively as she plopped onto the couch. "Oh, that. Well, they said I'll need to stay late for the next few weeks. You know, to learn the ropes and get a feel for how everything works. It's all part of onboarding," she said with a shrug. Her casual tone didn't match the weight of her words, but I decided to let it slide for now. "All right," I replied, "as long as it's worth it." She grinned and raised a hand in mock salute. "Trust me, it will be." True to her word, she started coming home later and later every evening. At first, it was just an hour, but soon it stretched to 2 or more. She'd always come in tired but happy, talking about how much she was learning and how exciting it all was. I couldn't help but notice how quickly she had immersed herself in this new role. It was like she had found a spark that had been missing for a long time. While I appreciated her enthusiasm, I couldn't ignore the slight unease creeping into the back of my mind. One evening, about a week into her new schedule, she came home practically glowing. "Guess what?" she said, holding up an envelope. "They gave me an advance." She tore it open with a flourish and pulled out a check. The amount was impressive, especially for someone who'd only been on the job for a week. "Isn't it amazing?" she asked, her eyes shining. I nodded, though I couldn't help but wonder why a company would give such a large advance so early on. She was already planning what to do with the money. "I'm going to save this for something special," she said, grabbing a jar from the kitchen and labeling it Dream Fund. She tucked the jar away on a high shelf in the pantry, out of sight but not out of mind. Later, I happened to catch a glimpse of her putting more cash into the jar. It wasn't just the advance, she already had a significant amount saved up. I decided not to say anything, figuring she'd tell me when the time was right. At dinner, I brought up the subject of her employment status. "What's the deal with your official hiring?" I asked. "Are they making any progress?" She shook her head, her expression remaining cheerful. "They're still working on it. Big companies have a lot of red tape, you know. But it's fine. They promised everything will be sorted soon." Her confidence was unshakable, but I couldn't help feeling skeptical. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. Before bed, she mentioned something that caught my attention. "By the way, my boss said they might have a big assignment for me soon." "Something really special," she said, her voice filled with anticipation. "It'll be a great opportunity." I asked for details, but she just smiled and shrugged. "I'll know more when they call. For now, it's just exciting to think about." Her optimism was infectious, even if I didn't fully understand what was going on. As we turned in for the night, I decided to hold off on asking more questions. Whatever this special assignment was, I'd find out soon enough. For now, it seemed best to let her enjoy the moment. The morning started with my wife's phone ringing incessantly. She picked it up quickly and launched into a long conversation. I couldn't make out much from her tone, part excitement, part seriousness, but the length of the call caught my attention. I watched as she paced the room, occasionally nodding and laughing softly at whatever was being said on the other end. After a good 20 minutes, I couldn't resist anymore. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She ended the call and turned to me with a wide smile. "You won't believe it," she said. "They're sending me on a business trip. And guess who's coming with me? My friend. Isn't that amazing?" Her enthusiasm was undeniable, but I felt a twinge of skepticism. "A business trip? With your friend?" "That's unusual," I replied, choosing my words carefully. She brushed off my concern with a wave of her hand. It's perfect. It'll be great to have her there, and we'll get so much done together. It's only for 4 days, so don't miss me too much, she teased. I nodded, still processing the information. All right, I said. Have a good trip. The following day passed uneventfully until I got a call from an old friend. His voice was casual at first, but it quickly shifted to something more serious. Hey, I'm at that VIP club I told you about, he said. You're not going to believe this, but I think I saw your wife here. My grip on the phone tightened. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice low and firm. He hesitated before continuing. You remember back in college when she lost that poker bet and got that tattoo on her ankle? Well, let's just say someone here matches the description exactly. I felt my stomach drop. You're sure? I asked. He sighed. I can't be 100%, but it looks a lot like her. Same tattoo, same everything. My mind raced as I tried to process what he was saying. Get me proof, I said, my tone sharp. I need to know for sure. He hesitated. I'm not supposed to take pictures in here, he said. My patience snapped. I don't care, I said, raising my voice. Just do it. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message. I opened it to find a grainy but unmistakable photo. The tattoo was there, as was the piercing she'd gotten a few years back. She lay in a hole and cheated on me with some guy in a jacket. There was no mistaking it. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. My mind went blank for a moment before a cold, simmering anger settled in. So that's what this business trip is about, I thought. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I wasn't about to confront her over the phone. No, this needed to be handled carefully. I needed a plan. If she thought she could deceive me, she was sorely mistaken. I'd been patient, supportive even, but this was crossing a line I couldn't ignore. For the rest of the day, I went through the motions, keeping my emotions in check. Every interaction with others felt distant, as if I were watching myself from the outside. Inside, I was already mapping out my next steps. There was no room for rash decisions, only calculated actions. By the time evening came, my resolve was solid. This wasn't just about what I'd seen in that photo. It was about trust, respect, and the foundation of our marriage. If she thought she could undermine that, she had another thing coming. For now, though, I'd let her believe everything was fine. Let her think she'd gotten away with it. But I knew better. This isn't over, I thought to myself. Not by a long shot. With my wife away on her so-called business trip, I had the house to myself. The lingering anger and betrayal from the night before hadn't subsided, and I knew I needed to take action. The first thing I did was search the house for the jar she'd labeled as her dream fund. It didn't take long to find it tucked away behind some cans in the pantry. Pulling it out, I saw it was filled with cash, far more than I'd expected. The date written on the jar matched exactly when she'd started her new job. My suspicion grew deeper as I realized she had been hiding more than just the money. I sat down at the kitchen table and counted the cash. It was a significant amount, far more than could be explained by a simple advance. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. What struck me the most was that, since she wasn't officially employed, she had no legal claim to these funds. If the money went missing, there would be no official record to prove its existence or its loss. That realization cemented my decision. I took every last bill, carefully packed it into an envelope, and drove to my parents' house to store it safely. Once the money was out of the house, I felt a small measure of relief. But this was only the first step. On the drive back home, I called a lawyer, someone I trusted to handle sensitive matters discreetly. When he picked up, I explained the situation in broad strokes, leaving out the more salacious details for now. I want to start divorce proceedings, I said firmly. But it has to be done quietly. She can't know until everything is ready. He assured me it could be arranged, but he also advised that we'd need to bide our time to ensure the process went smoothly. His advice made sense, and I agreed to follow it. However, as I hung up the phone, a new thought occurred to me. If her new job and this business trip were part of something shady, I couldn't just let it slide. Not only for my sake, but because whatever she was involved in could have wider implications. That's when I decided to escalate things. If what I suspected was true, there were authorities who needed to know. Back at home, I sat down at my desk and composed an anonymous email to the local police department. I kept the message short and to the point, outlining what I believed about the so-called VIP club she'd been connected to. "This isn't a club," I wrote. "It's a front for a brothel. Wealthy clients, secret rooms, illegal activities, it's all there. You need to investigate." I didn't include any personal details, ensuring the report couldn't be traced back to me. After sending the email, I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long breath. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore, it was about justice. If even half of what I suspected was true, this wasn't just a personal issue, it was a criminal one. I knew the police might take time to act, but at least I had done my part to bring the truth to light. As the day wore on, I stayed focused on the next steps. The divorce proceedings needed to be handled meticulously, and I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. My lawyer's words echoed in my mind, patience was key. Still, knowing I had already taken the first steps gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks. By the time evening came, I had a plan in motion. The money was secure, the legal wheels were turning, and the authorities were notified. I couldn't predict how everything would unfold, but I was prepared to see it through. As I sat down to dinner alone, I thought about the chain of events that had led me to this point. One thing was clear, this wasn't just about me anymore. The stakes were far higher than I'd imagined. Knowing the storm that was bound to come, I decided to take preemptive action. I called my wife early that morning, keeping my tone light and casual. "Hey," I said, "just wanted to let you know I've been called away for a work trip. It's out of town and will last a couple of days, so I won't be around. Just wanted to keep you updated." She seemed a little distracted, but she responded with a vague acknowledgement before ending the call. It was just as well. I needed her to believe I wasn't around to deal with what was about to happen. I packed a small bag and drove to my parents' house. It was comforting to be in a familiar place, surrounded by people I could trust. Over dinner, I kept the conversation light, not wanting to involve them in the details of what was unfolding. Meanwhile, I kept my phone nearby, knowing it wouldn't be long before my wife realized the money was missing. Sure enough, my instincts were right. The first call came in the early afternoon. Her voice was shaky and filled with panic. "You won't believe what happened," she said, barely holding back tears. "I've been fired. And it's not just me, the police came and took my boss away. Everything's falling apart." I kept my response measured, offering a simple, "That's terrible. I'm so sorry to hear that." She went on about how unfair it all was, but I didn't give her much to work with. "I'm not in town right now," I reminded her. "Let's talk about it when I get back." A couple of hours later, the second call came. This time, her tone was more accusatory. "Where's the jar?" she demanded. "The one I kept in the pantry. It's gone." I played dumb, feigning confusion. "Jar? What jar? I don't know what you're talking about." She didn't buy it, pressing further, but I cut her off. "I'm busy right now," I said firmly. "We can talk later." Before she could argue, I ended the call. It was clear she was unraveling, and while part of me felt a twinge of guilt, I reminded myself why I was doing this. She had crossed too many lines, and now she was facing the consequences of her own actions. I stayed at my parents' house for the rest of the day, keeping my phone on silent to avoid further interruptions. That evening, I sat down to assess the situation. Her job was gone, the shady operation she was involved in was under investigation, and she was left scrambling to figure out what to do next. My plan was working exactly as intended, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down yet. There were still a few more steps to take before everything was finalized. The next day, I received another call from her. This time, she sounded more desperate than angry. She begged me to come home, insisting that we needed to talk in person. I stayed firm, repeating that I was out of town for work and couldn't come back yet. "We'll figure everything out when I return," I said, keeping my tone neutral. As I hung up, I felt a sense of resolution. The pieces were falling into place, and the end was in sight. My focus now was on executing the final steps of my plan with precision. There was no turning back, and I was determined to see it through to the end. It was a relief when my lawyer called with good news. The divorce process was moving forward smoothly, and everything was falling into place. "You've got nothing to worry about," he said. "Most of the assets are protected since they were acquired before the marriage. Legally, she doesn't have much of a claim to them. The documents are ready, all you need to do is sign them and deliver them to her." I thanked him, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. It was time to finalize this chapter and move on. Later that day, I collected the finalized divorce papers from the lawyer's office. The thick envelope represented months of planning, frustration, and hard decisions. Instead of handing them over casually, I decided to add a touch of finality. I stopped by a store on the way home and bought a gift box and some ribbon. If she was going to receive the end of our marriage, it would come wrapped like the conclusion it was. Back at home, I carefully placed the papers inside the box, tied it with a bow, and called a courier service. The delivery was scheduled for later that evening. It was a strange moment, knowing that this act would officially end everything between us. I had no second thoughts. Her actions had made this decision inevitable, and I was resolute in my choice. When the courier picked up the package, I gave them clear instructions to deliver it directly to her. I didn't want any room for delays or excuses. With the package out of my hands, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. It felt like the final step in regaining control of my life. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm. A few hours later, my phone buzzed. It was her. The second I answered, I was met with a mix of sobs and shouting. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "You can't be serious." I remained calm, letting her vent. When she paused to catch her breath, I responded evenly. "It's exactly what it looks like. You can keep doing whatever you want, but it won't be with me anymore." My words only seemed to fuel her anger. She began crying harder, her tone shifting between desperation and fury. "You'll regret this," she spat. "You have no idea what you're doing. This isn't over." I stayed silent, letting her rant without interruption. Her words didn't sting, they only reinforced my decision. When she realized I wasn't going to engage, she hung up, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the dial tone. Sitting there in the quiet, I reflected on how far things had come. Her tears and anger were predictable, but they didn't shake me. The marriage had become a toxic weight, and now I was free of it. Still, her parting words stuck with me. "This isn't over," she had said. It sounded like a threat, but it also felt empty, like a last-ditch effort to cling to something already gone. Despite her dramatic response, I knew this was the right decision. There was no going back. The chapter was closed, and I had taken every step necessary to protect myself and my future. Whatever came next, I would be ready for it. For now, I let the quiet of the evening settle around me, knowing I had done what needed to be done. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I walked into the courtroom with calm determination. My lawyer had prepared me well, and I knew exactly what to expect. As the proceedings began, my wife launched into a tirade of accusations. She painted me as an abuser, claiming I had mistreated her emotionally and even physically. Her words were dramatic, her delivery rehearsed, but I didn't flinch. I had anticipated this and had come armed with the truth. When it was my turn to respond, I kept my composure. My lawyer presented a stack of evidence, text messages, emails, financial records, and even character statements from friends and family. Each piece systematically dismantled her claims. The courtroom grew quieter as the truth emerged, her web of lies unraveling under scrutiny. She had no solid proof to back her accusations, and the judge's patience with her theatrics was visibly wearing thin. By the time the hearing ended, the verdict was clear. The court ruled in my favor, dismissing her allegations entirely. She left the courtroom in a storm of frustration, while I walked out feeling vindicated. It wasn't about winning, it was about protecting my integrity and ensuring that the truth prevailed. My lawyer congratulated me on the outcome, but I knew this was only part of the battle. With the divorce finalized, I wasted no time in putting the past behind me. Selling the house was my next step. It had too many memories tied to it, most of which I wanted to leave behind. The process went smoothly, and within weeks, I had closed the sale and moved closer to my parents. Being near them felt like the right choice, a chance to rebuild my life with a strong support system nearby. One of the perks of my profession was the ability to work remotely, which made the transition easier. My new home was modest but comfortable, and it gave me the fresh start I needed. I settled into a routine quickly, focusing on my work and reconnecting with old friends in the area. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace and stability. However, peace didn't mean I could completely escape the aftermath. Friends began reaching out with strange stories. Apparently, my ex-wife had been contacting them, asking for information about me. She wanted to know where I was, what I was doing, and whether I was seeing anyone new. The desperation in her actions was almost pitiable, but it also left me uneasy. I tried to ignore the rumors at first, chalking them up to her inability to let go. But as the calls and messages from friends continued, it became clear that she was actively searching for me. Her persistence was unsettling, and I couldn't help but wonder what her endgame was. Was it revenge? Reconciliation? Something else entirely? As I sat in my quiet new home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Her behavior was unpredictable, and while I had no intention of letting her back into my life, I couldn't ignore the potential for trouble. For now, all I could do was stay vigilant and hope that whatever she was planning would come to nothing. The day started like any other, quiet and uneventful, until the sound of knocking at the door disrupted the calm. I opened it to find my ex-wife standing there, flanked by 2 police officers. She wasted no time launching into a tirade, her voice raised and accusatory. "You stole my money," she yelled. "Where is it? Where did you hide the jar?" Her face was flushed with anger, but I remained calm, crossing my arms as I stood in the doorway. "What money?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "We're divorced, remember? Everything was settled in the divorce agreement." My words only seemed to fuel her frustration. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You took it. There was a jar, and I know you hid it somewhere in this house." One of the officers stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Sir, we're here to follow up on her claims. Do you mind if we take a look around?" I nodded without hesitation. "Go ahead," I said. "I have nothing to hide." The officers entered and began their search, moving methodically from room to room. Meanwhile, my ex-wife stood in the living room, muttering under her breath. I leaned against the wall, watching her with a mix of disbelief and annoyance. It was almost surreal to see how far she was willing to go in her desperation. The search didn't take long. My house wasn't large, and there were few places to hide anything significant. The officers checked closets, drawers, and even under the furniture. When they finished, they returned to the living room and shook their heads. "There's nothing here," one of them said. "We've conducted a thorough search, and we couldn't find anything resembling the item you described." My ex-wife's face twisted with frustration. "It has to be here," she insisted. "He's lying. He must have hidden it somewhere else." The second officer, clearly growing tired of the situation, turned to her. "Do you have any proof that these funds existed in the first place? Do you have bank statements, employment records, or anything else to corroborate your claim?" That was the moment her entire argument fell apart. She stammered, unable to produce a single piece of evidence. The truth was unavoidable, her money was unaccounted for, and her lack of official employment meant she had no legal claim or documentation to support her story. The officers exchanged glances before one of them gently took her arm. "We've done all we can here. Let's go." As they escorted her out, she turned back to me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and defeat. "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking. I didn't respond. I simply watched as they left, the door closing behind them. The silence that followed was profound, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of finality. In the days and weeks that followed, I heard nothing more from her. It was as though she had vanished from my life entirely. Whatever plans she had to continue her pursuit of the non-existent jar had evaporated. I settled into my new routine, enjoying the peace and stability that had been missing for so long. For me, life moved on, finally free of the chaos she had brought.